So I think, whoa, it's nice and loud. I think we'll get started. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the FCC, newcomers and frequent flyers alike. I see lots of frequent flyers here. I'm Julie Carney, Chief of the Space Bureau. Before we start, I want to acknowledge those communities that have been impacted by Hurricane Helene and those who are in the path of Hurricane Milton. The FCC is here to help you. To quote Chairwoman Rosenworcel, when disaster strikes, the FCC will always have boots on the ground. Now I turn to today's event. Thank you for joining us for the sixth in the event in the Space Bureau's Transparency Initiative, where we provide user-friendly information and guidance to interested parties about the Commission's procedures and processes. The Transparency Initiative is part of the Chairwoman's Space Innovation Agenda to support the new space age. Today we're presenting with our friends from the Office of Engineering and Technology. We'll tell you all you need to know about experimental licensing for space and Earth stations. The common denominator for experimental licenses is that all missions are for short-term, non-commercial operation of space and Earth stations. Now let's take a little walk down memory lane. In 1962, when the FCC licensed its first satellite, Telstar-1, it was the first satellite built by a private company, AT&T, which paid for the launching costs. It was the first active repeater satellite to transmit internationally, and it was the first satellite to operate on the high microwave frequencies. And ever since Telstar-1, the FCC has been actively engaged in licensing commercial satellites to do so much more than we ever could have imagined. Telstar-1 was capable of handling 600 one-way telephone messages, or 60 two-way telephone conversations, or one TV transmission at a time. Yes, NAB. Today, we are licensing spectrum for companies engaged in novel space applications, like manufacturing in space, 3D printing in space, minerals extraction from asteroids, rendezvous and proximity operations, Earth observation for climate and imaging uses, and lunar communications. Thanks for joining me on this trip down memory lane. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Whitney Lohmeyer, the Space Bureau's Chief Technologist, and she will lead our discussions today. I'll leave it on.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Just to echo what Julie said, it's so nice to see new faces as well as repeat attendees. And we're going to be talking about experimental licensing. It's a really important part of our industry. As several, I'm sure, of you know, the rules and regulations of the FCC are codified in Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And our first transparency event focused on Part 25 of those rules, so commercial, non-federal space stations. And today we're going to be focusing on Part 5, so experimental licenses for commercial space and Earth stations. And I've had the pleasure of working with a couple of you in the room on these sorts of licenses, but they are critical for mission demonstration or hardware development for private sector, as well as academic sector. So CubeSats are an incredible educational platform for engineering and systems students, and they're often flown to conduct science or technology demonstrations. And so all these sorts of missions file experimental applications through OET. We have a couple slides here. I'm going to cover the introduction, which is happening right now, and going to hand it over to Tony, who's going to go over some of these helpful guidance documents we've put together for satellites and Earth stations. And like Julie mentioned, then we're going to have a panel discussion. So time has flown, but we kicked off this transparency initiative over a year ago, and the whole purpose of this is to help applicants, both longtime applicants or new entrants, understand our process in a kind of user-friendly way with templates and helpful guidance documents. And we've put together checklists for experimental licenses, which Tony's going to walk through, as well as templates, which you can use to kind of more effectively provide information and hopefully do so in a way that expedites the review process. I can't stress enough just the importance of including as much information as possible in these applications. I think when we talk about the panel or have the discussion on the panel, one of the main themes is, make sure you have all of the different components. So our transparency initiative is live. It's been live for about a year. If you just search in any sort of web browsing FCC Transparency Initiative, it's going to take you to this page with Julie's smile right on the front cover. And in the submenu, you'll see Transparency Initiative, which you can click, and we'll see what that brings you to next. But I also wanted to highlight a Meet With Us submenu, which is new since our last event. And if you'll tell all your friends about this, effectively what we've done here is taken time to provide you with a resource to handle logistics for coming and talking to us. Prior to joining the FCC, I always thought, I don't want to bother them with just like who we are for a client, but it's actually so helpful for us to meet with you even 30 minutes, 15 minutes, just to put a face to an email and more context to a mission name or a company name. And we also love hearing updates from you all too. Occasionally we'll get press releases or things, and that's one thing that's, of my perspective, that's changed since joining the Bureau, is just how useful these meetings are. So before handing it over to Tony, if you were to click on that Transparency Initiative, you'll see a submenu that's Part 5 experimental licenses, and that will bring you to a page with the checklist we're going to go over today, a link to the experimental licensing system where you submit your experimental licensing, and more useful resources. But with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tony, who's going to cover OET's important role in all of the experimental licensing process. And this is for the slides.
Okay, thank you. Is that too close? All right, I'll back off a little bit. All right. Good morning. Thanks, Whitney. So my name's Tony Serafini in OET's experimental branch, and I've been around the FCC for 34 years now, so I've kind of been here a while. Didn't leave. So as Julie said, our hearts are with folks who just went through, the hurricane and ones that's coming, and I have some memories since I've been here. It gives me chills thinking of 9/11, granting an STA for a thing to transmit to try to detect badges in the rubble. We've also done Katrina. We've done balloons over Puerto Rico when Puerto Rico was hit. So OETs, STAs are able to respond where the service rules don't exist. So, and then another history lesson. When I started, there was an OET treaty branch that did the international relations cross-border, and then there was a satellite branch, and that became the International Bureau, and now we got 2 bureaus, and I've got 5 people. So we had 6. 1 escaped and retired in June, but I just want to give them all the credit for all their hard work. You'll hear their names, and we're very open and very accessible. Ben, Leanne, Nimesh have been with me a while, and then newer faces are Hung, and Travis is a new guy who's doing a lot of our help stuff that Doug used to do, so and doing a great job. So we get over 3,000, close to 3,500 applications all across the FCC services, and satellite's just one portion of that. So my guys are juggling 60, 70 applications at a time. So they're definitely rock stars, and I appreciate them. So, so as I said, Part 5 deals with everything that is not an allocated service. It exists to support innovation and equipment development and market trials. And so space has just exploded the last 5-10 years and just keeps increasing with innovation and technology. And that's how we get a lot of the work. We are the gatekeepers, and then we rely heavily on the expertise in the Satellite Bureau to review the specifics, and as well as work with NTIA to coordinate shared spectrum. So that's kind of our role. But we're not as much as analyzing the applications as we are facilitating them. So like I said, we get UAVs, equipment development, DoD contracts, Apple developing equipment before they get certification, or Google. We also get involved in everyday events. The political conventions need extra radios for public safety and broadcast spectrum. So that's a peak demand that we're able to support, as well as later the inauguration or even the Olympics. And then we get to space. So we deal with the launches because the rules aren't finalized for that. I got an email this morning of a picture from the ULA launch of a grant we just did. And all of the SpaceX launches, we do the booster, the barge, the Dragon. So the astronauts going up, a lot of times are getting a $140 ticket from Part 5. So it's a pretty good bargain. So next time you buy a Southwest airline ticket, and it's per vehicle, so it's, the astronauts going up on Blue Origin aren't getting $140 a pop. They all ride together for $140. It's pretty cheap. So that's kind of in a nutshell what we do. The Part 2 allocation is done through our rule writers, where they're proposing the rules for new services. And then a lot of those services are being tested under Part 5 before they transition to the regular service. So let me check. See. So, and then we we recently had our bureau chief Ron retired, and so now Ira Keltz is acting, and Ira's very well versed in our experimental, and work quite well with him, and he's very active. So we're in good hands with Ira in the transition. And let's see. So as far as specifics on the Part 5 satellites, this is our OET landing page. The application is very generic because we do all services. So it is not service specific. On the left-hand side are all the different forms. If a mission is going to operate for 6 months or less, we would do what's called special temporary authority, and that's a little bit different process that we do, and the form's a little bit less detailed, but we still need the same information. It just is the way the service is defined. For longer missions, you would file what's called the Form 442, and those we grant up to 2 years. They can go longer, up to 5, and they are renewable. The STAs are not renewable. If they need to extend, the rules specify they would file a Form 442, and then we would go through that process. Let's see. so I don't think, okay, so here's some of this. And Whitney and folks in Space Bureau putting this together, it's a little detailed, but you'll see it on the web. But they've done a great job putting together resources. So the satellite and space applications are very detailed, and we need a lot of information, which isn't necessarily captured on the form, but then you can check out the resources of the additional information we'll need to be able to review the technical aspects. So there's things as far as the mission description, specifying what exactly you're going to be doing. There's the orbital debris report that needs to be submitted with an application. We have the ITU filings for Space Cap, and the folks in Space Bureau are very good, Joe and others, to answer specifics on that. You have to download software and make filings for that in a database submission that gets filed with the ITU as well. Then what else do we need? If it's a shared band, there is a format we submit to NTIA that goes through their electronic filing system. And so there's an NTIA cheat sheet as well of all the data that they need us to submit to get in the voting process. So it starts adding up quick, and that's what we'll emphasize, getting as much information followed as possible helps us proceed without needing to come back asking for more information. And so then there's also, I guess, a cost recovery letter that needs to go to ITU saying that, you're responsible for the international fees and not the government. And so we'll need folks, as far as the point of contacts, who can respond. If you have a consultant or a law firm filing, you'll want them to monitor their emails and make sure that they're looking for emails or questions that we submit back to get more information. Let's see, what else do I want to say? So I think those are the highlights, but then I can't see that anymore. But you guys can go through those. Like I said, the links have lots of detail. There's lots of information. If this is new to you, the staff is accessible. We divvy up our work by alphabet. We haven't found a better way to do it. So somebody will pick up the application, and we've done statistics on what letter files how much, and then we kind of break it up. But once we pick up an application, we'll review it, see what's missing, and then email back and forth to get it as a complete package so we can move it forward. Let's see what else. Yeah, so these are some of the examples, the technical information, the antenna sizes, polarity, the frequency. One tip, if you're doing a band, don't make the band equal to the emission. NTIA doesn't like that. So use a center frequency. And what else is up there? Our form says ERP. A lot of times people need the EIRP as well. The coordinates, Earth station coordinates, your antenna dimensions, a lot of the NTIA format. If you can't sleep, go to the Red Book and look up Chapter 9 coding And if you start with the orb line, you'll pull your hair out because that one's frustrating. But that's critical because one letter off and it gets bounced by NTIA, and then we have to go back. What else is up there? So we also license mostly the transmitter, but we need all of this data. NTIA needs that for the analysis of interference to any licensee. So Part 5 is not protected. That's one thing. We can license anything on any band, but you have no vested rights, no protection. So that's kind of the trade-off. And
Great.
I think that's good.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So we're going to transition to our panel now. And before I do, and before the other panelists introduce themselves, just want to reiterate that the more information you can provide, the better it is effectively on our end to help us with that licensing process. Tony also mentioned outside counsel, so sometimes applicants will work with outside counsel to do anything from the entire application if you just don't want to bother with it, or just have them review, and that can also help with the process if you're brand new, or if at any point in your timeline. And we wanted to thank folks who had submitted questions to us via our SAT-info email address. This email is always live if you have questions or general concerns. We've tried to address the questions we received through that email in our panel. If your question wasn't addressed, it might be that we've embedded it in our guidance documents, or that we'll be following up with you individually. But we don't have a live mic, so if something comes to your mind, you're inspired to ask something, feel free in real time to submit it to satinfo@fcc. All right, so we've heard from Tony in a little bit about your history here. I wanted to give a few minutes to Sankar and Franco, who've, I think, both been panelists at some of our previous transparency events, to introduce themselves, maybe tell a little about your story as well as your participation in the experimental licensing process.
Thank you, Whitney, and good morning to everyone. So a little bit about me. I started at a commission 24 years ago. When I started, I joined what was the International Bureau at the time. Worked there primarily in satellite licensing and rulemaking involving satellites. I also did some work, for a large part of that time, I was also doing ITU work. I was involved in Working Party 4C. For those of you who has followed the ITU work, Working Party 4C focus on the mobile satellite service and the radio navigation satellite service at the ITU. I chaired that group, the U.S. Working Party group, that is, for, I don't know, almost 10 years, 10, 12 years. And after that, after the 2019 conference, I decided to take a break from ITU work. Not because I didn't like it. I did enjoy it, but because I had young kids, and I think their time needed me more than what I needed to do with the ITU. So it was a good transition. It was a good timing, and no regrets. With respect to some of the work that I'm doing here, currently I focus mostly on rulemaking proceedings and Part 5 satellite-related applications. So yeah, we review when there's a Part 5 satellite application comes into Tony's branch. Usually, if it involves satellite, it comes to us in the satellite licensing division. We review those for the various elements to make the application acceptable, including the ITU paperwork that needs to be filed with the ITU, orbital debris mitigation assessment, and all the other elements that's necessary for the licensing of the satellite. So that's basically, from my perspective, a little bit on me. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Franco Hinojosa, the Chief of Earth Station Licensing Division. I've been with the Bureau for 2 years, with the FCC for 2 years. Prior to that, I didn't do any regulatory work whatsoever. However, I've been involved with SATCOM communications for the last 15 years. I've done a lot of work for the DoD, mostly as a contractor, but also as a civilian. Prior to that, I was in the Navy doing jet engines, so not even close to FCC work. I'm an engineer by trade, so keep that in mind when you talk to me about regulations. My division is in charge of doing all the Earth Station licensing. When it comes to Part 5, as Sankar said, whenever a Part 5 request for an Earth Station comes in, it goes to Tony's branch, and then it gets funneled into our division. Then we kind of assign it, we look at it. Now, we don't only look at Earth Station requests, we looked at a lot of requests, so we have to sift through the information sometimes just to figure out whether it's an Earth Station or not. But overall, we have to provide some type of information to Tony. That's pretty much it. Thanks.
Thank you. So the first few questions are going to go back to Tony. We've heard about some examples of the experimental licenses you've issued over the years. In general, how would you classify the types of experiments that you see for satellites and Earth stations?
So we do get a wide variety because of the cutting-edge innovation going on. So we'll get universities doing research. We'll get contractors to DoD who are doing research, commercial companies as well. So it's a wide range of different people that are following. And so different expertise too as well. So grad students who've never done anything with the government and other people who, have followed. Usually the first one's the hardest to get through.
And some of the forms seem to be more centered around transmitters. You kind of touched on this. I've heard also in the past, like, the FCC doesn't license receivers. What is the deal with that? Do I only need to submit information on my transmitter?
So the FCC authority is regulating transmitters. So we, I think, have had initiatives to do receiver standards, but that's really not in the Communications Act necessarily. But as far as the either Earth Station or the satellite, on our license, we will put the transmitter. There'll be location for Earth Station on the license as well, but that's generally the transmitting back from the Earth Station. We don't license, which may be different than what the Space Bureau does, Earth Station only receive, but we need all the information. So we need both ends of the link. We need the transmitter antenna data, we need the transmit power, we need the receiver specs for analysis that NTIA asks us. So if it's satellite coming down, we need the receive information. If it's TT&C going back up, we'll need the transmit from the Earth Station as well as the receive antenna information on the satellite. So we do need a lot of data.
Thank you. And last question, when should I file my experimental application?
So that one, there's the integration date that folks, and I had a show and tell. So this is a 2U CubeSat, so the specs of a unit. So these get packed and integrated, and that's usually months before launch. And they stuff them in and screw on the top and get it ready to launch. And so that's generally, lead time. So you want to count back from there, give us 3 to 6 months, just to be able to go back and forth and do all the coordination if there's any issues or questions. So yeah, 3 to 6 months out is a good rule of thumb. we don't want anything more than a year out, because then we don't know what's coming down the pipe, especially NTIA doesn't like to see them that early.
Thank you. And the next question's for Sankar. On the checklist, we saw a section about ITU filings. And I'm curious if I need to submit an ITU filing for an experimental license, and if I do, why?
Thank you, Whitney. That's a very good question. With respect to the ITU filing, do I need to file an ITU filing? If you're going to be launching a satellite or something, an object in space that's going to be used for communications, then yes, you need to file an ITU filing, which is a space gap filing describing the mission and the technical parameters of the system, including the orbital characteristics. Why do we need to do it? Well, we do have a treaty obligation with the ITU. Specifically, for those who are familiar with the ITU radio regulations, Article 11.2 of the radio regulations tell us that if you have any object in space that's going to be transmitting or involve international communications, which most satellites are involved in, and are capable of causing interference to any country, neighboring countries, or any other country, then we have an obligation to the ITU to file with the ITU to disclose what it is we are doing. So we do have treaty obligations with respect to the ITU for filing of space objects, and so that's why we need to file.
And how long would you expect an ITU filing to complete for an experimental satellite mission?
So for the space gap filing, or an ITU filing, which the space gap is primarily the bulk of the work, the antenna diagrams, which is the GIMS files, do take some time. But in order 2 to 3 days, you should be able to complete an ITU filing. Now, if you're familiar with the software, you can get it done in a few hours. But for most cases, especially for Part 5, the university students and stuff like that, it takes them some time to learn. So that may take a few days, 2 to 3 days, depends, yeah.
Thank you.
And I just want to add, if you run into issue, feel free to reach out to us, call us, and we'll try to help as much as we can.
Thank you. Franco, question for you. You mentioned how OET receives all of these experimental licenses, and then they send the Earth stations over to you. What are some of the common questions you have to follow up with applicants on?
Right. So, like I said earlier, right, we do receive a whole bunch of experimental applications, and most of them are not for Earth stations. So we have to sift through them. So I must emphasize that, please, on your narrative, explain that what you're asking for is for an Earth station application. With that said, most of the stuff that we get are just missing information or incorrect parameters, usually technical parameters. We're missing ERP, power levels, the satellite points of communication. Sometimes they're not authorized, they're asking to communicate with unauthorized satellites, or they haven't been launched yet and they want to get their station license right away. Things like that. Another thing that we notice is that sometimes applicants will, use an old application and try to just edit. If you're going to do that, that's fine, that's great. However, make sure that everything in there is correct and it matches what you're trying to do, because otherwise we're going to have to go back and forth, and it's just going to delay the actual granting of the application.
Thank you. Tony, you've mentioned numerous aspects of the filing to keep in mind. Are there any other helpful hints you haven't touched on?
Sure. So the form, like I said, has contact information. So you want to make sure that the person who can respond is, on the contact, and be able to respond and turn things around, because we'll send an email and then we move on to another application until we hear a response. And so that's part of the back and forth. So that, and then, is reiterating what Franco said, making sure that the application is as complete as possible. So it's, sometimes we'll get people that just want to say, oh, can I, just file and get in the queue, and thinking that's going to help, but it doesn't. So if we have a complete package, then we can just move on. But if we get missing components, then that just means we have to come back to you and ask for that, and then it's just parked until we get that. So anything you can do ahead of time to make sure it's as complete as possible, that's the best way to go.
Thank you. And Sankar, are there areas you've noticed that are often overlooked in the process?
Yeah, I mean, looking at some of the satellite applications, some of the things that we have noticed, Part 5 satellite applications, that is, some of the things that we have noticed, if you're going to be using a shared band that's shared with the government, it's always advisable to reach out to the government, to NTIA or the government agencies that may have frequency use in those bands. It certainly helps in the coordination process, and typically when we see applications and we reach out to NTIA, a lot of times it takes a lot of time to get those coordinated. But if you reach out ahead of time, it certainly helps the process. Plus, it will help you to know exactly which band you can and cannot use, and so you can tailor your application to get it done quickly. So that's one area where we see things applicants tend to overlook. Also, on the orbital debris mitigation side, there are a few elements. So there are two. Generally, NASA has a form for orbital debris mitigation, and people tend to follow that form, and it's fine for the simple reason if you're going to get a ride with NASA, typically they want you to fill out that form and make sure that you comply with their requirements. But in addition to that, we have some additional requirements in our rules that are not included in NASA form, such as for example, one of our rules require that once the satellite is deployed, do you have a means to identify that satellite? Do you have an active or passive way of identifying that satellite for tracking purposes? Applicants tend to overlook that kind of information. And a simple reason I can think of is because they're following their NASA form, and NASA doesn't require that information. Also, an additional element is whether you're going to register with the 18th Squadron to track your satellites once it's deployed over the lifetime of that object in space. Generally, we want to know that information for space situational awareness. We know what's up there, what's the likelihood in case you come into physical collision with another object or in close approach with another object. Those are information we like to know. And it's required by the rules, by the way. So those are some areas where we have noticed where things tend to be overlooked. We have to go back to the applicant and get those information from them. So it's primarily on the orbital debris side and the coordination side of things.
Thank you. So coordination is a word we often hear, but I want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit more about this, as well as you said, the 18th Squadron. So we'll revisit both of those things. Tony, what type of coordination is required for Part 5 experimentals?
So depending on the band and the operation, so a lot of satellites are doing imaging. That is going to require you to work with NOAA to review licensing with NOAA. So we will need a letter from NOAA saying either yes or no. So that, and as well other agencies, if you can reach out to NASA, that's always helpful to review frequencies to make sure they don't have any concerns with any of their systems, because we'll get feedback a lot of times where things go to NTIA and get tabled for more information. So pre-coordination like that is always helpful.
Thank you. And Franco, in your experience, does the FCC require any proof of coordination, or is it simply assumed to have occurred?
As Sankar and Tony stated, it all depends on the bands. But especially in bands shared with the federal government, if you have completed coordination with any of the federal agencies, you can ask them to basically provide that information on a letterhead, or you can provide any documentation that states that you've done that. But also be mindful that sometimes we'll require some type of coordination, especially with fixed services, right? When earth stations or satellites are communicating using bands where fixed services are co-equal on the band, we might ask them to provide some type of coordination documentation.
Thank you. Sankar, you mentioned the 18th Space Defense Squadron. I want to revisit that. So this is the group that currently manages the website SpaceTrack, and that tracks satellites in space and provides conjunction warnings. Who should register and what should they do?
Yeah. So with respect to the 18th Squadron, spacetrack.org. I mean, that's a website. You can go there, and who should register? Well, if you have any object in space, a satellite. Well, most often it's a satellite. That would be the place for you to go, spacetrack.org, and I think they have a link there where you can register your object. It may be a little bit more involved, but certainly all the information you need would be available on that website. And you can reach out to them, give them a call. I've talked to them a couple of times, and they're very helpful and always responsive. So that's where you would register. The 18th Squadron, like you said, is more so involved in space situational awareness, what's object in space, where they're going, the trajectory, and that kind of stuff. So yes.
Thank you. Okay, only a few more questions left. Franco, we've talked about, if people have questions, to just contact us. We have this open door policy. Can I contact the Earth Station Licensing Division directly for experimental Earth Station application status or questions?
Not really. Not directly, right? We ask you guys to go through OET because OET is handling your submission. They'll be more in touch and more aware of the status of the application, more so than us. We don't do a lot of the coordination with NTIA. They do it. So if you come to us, make sure that they know that you're going to come to us, or they will reach out to us in turn. If you have a question, they will go and reach out to us. We have no problem helping you. We just want to make sure that they are aware of what's going on.
Thank you.
Let me.
Oh, go ahead.
Just another perspective on that. So even if someone calls me, I generally will either check or defer to the person in the branch who's working on the application because they have the latest information. They have the latest status. And if I'm getting calls or Space Bureau is getting calls, they may not have the latest information. So we, try to make sure that doesn't cause problems. People get calls from the Pentagon sometimes, and they think they're helping, but it doesn't. And so too many cooks doesn't work for us. So it's best either to, I'll defer to my people because I don't want to mess things up. So that's why, or if we want you to get to the expert, we'll tell you call Franco. So that's the best way to go.
Thank you. So Franco, I've been preparing my application. I've reviewed the checklists that are on the website, the table of frequency allocations, and I've realized that my operations aren't allowed by the current rules. How do I handle this request?
We understand that experimental applications by nature are going to be in bands that are not normally used by but they could be on bands that are normally used by satellite or earth stations. So we will work with you. One of the things that we will ask you to do basically is to show us how you intend to mitigate any type of interference to the current users of the band. As much information, if you were able to pre-coordinate with them, if you can demonstrate that or tell us exactly what you're going to do to your system to prevent any type of interference to current users. that will help a lot.
Thank you. And so for our last question, we're going to come back to Tony. And I'm curious if there are any circumstances beyond the provision of commercial services, fees, receipt of payments that would make an application for authority under Part 25 more appropriate than an experimental license under Part 5.
Sure. So a lot of times people will start out in Part 5, and as they develop their technology, they're getting ready to move on to the next stage. And so the reason we'll try to kick people out when we feel you've ended your purpose in Part 5 is if you're transitioning to a commercial operation and you also receive protection under Part 25. So, once you're, ready to move on, then we try to kick you out of the nest. So.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and thank you again for coming today. I'm going to hand it over to Julie to close us out.
Thank you so much. Love collaboration among the bureaus and offices here at the FCC. Thanks so much for coming. For those of you online and those of you in the room who want to watch more videos from our Transparency Initiative, go to the FCC's YouTube channel, and there's a link for Transparency Initiative. I'd love to give our panel a huge round of applause. And there were several more of our colleagues who were instrumental in putting this together today, including Jeanette Kennedy, who is quietly in the back of the room. Stay and socialize with us for a bit. We have the room until noon. So for those of you online, hello and goodbye. And for those of you in the room, let's have a great time. Thank you so much.